Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
I welcome you to the sixth week in our series titled Celebrating Humor and Music, Conversations with Comedians and Musicians from the Past. We're really enjoying this series, and as you know, for the members of our audience who have been watching over the weeks, we have scholars to come here and portray famous people in history, and we're doing that again today. And therefore, under that Chautauqua format, we welcome to the program Will Rogers, who was born on November the 4th in 1879 in the Indian Territory that was known as Oklahoma and it would become the state of Oklahoma. Our guest was very famous as an Indian cowboy from the Cherokee Nation, and he also became an expert writer and a rope twirler, and later starred in Wild West shows and vaudeville programs around the world, and moved to Hollywood, where he became so famous, and he did a column and just was one of the best-known people in America. With that, Mr. Rogers, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. You know, I was the only person I know that will admit to being born on election day, but it never did me any good. I've never been elected to nothing.
That just happens sometimes, doesn't it?
That's right. You know, it was back before women could vote, and all the men had gone into town to cast their ballots, and Mama decided she would do something to get even with the politicians. So she stayed home and had me.
I see.
That's right.
That's what happened. She had that well planned. And our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, an attorney in the state of Idaho. Next to her is Erna Reinhardt, who is Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College. And Janelle will commence today's questioning.
Welcome to the program, Will Rogers.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to meet you and talk about your background a little bit. What did you do as a growing up person? You told us how you were born.
Yes.
Now, what happened as you were growing up?
Well, I was a little boy, you know, and played and did all the things that little boys do. My papa was a cowman, and he made a pretty good living at it, too, and I thought probably that's what I would end up doing. But, you know, aside from riding and learned to rope a little bit when I was a young fella, I went to school. Seemed like I went to school a lot. Papa said that if I was going to have a future, I needed to get an education, and so he started sending me to school. And he sent me to just about every school in the territory before it was over. But I didn't stay in any of them very long.
Did you then have, like, what we would call a high school education today?
Well, I was there long
Our
enough.
time.
Yes. As I said, I was almost in every school in the territory. And I stayed in usually until we'd get to about McGuffey's fourth reader. I got to where I knew McGuffey's fourth reader better than McGuffey. But I'm sorry I never took a chance on the fifth grade. And finally, Papa got impatient with me and sent me up to Missouri to Scarrett College and then eventually to Kemper Military Institute. I think he hoped I'd learn a little discipline. But I was more interested in being a cowboy. And when I got the chance, I took off and just quit education for good. I went out to the Texas Panhandle and I got a job on a ranch, driving some cows. Well, by the time I'd done that for a while and ended up back at the ranch, I think Papa had kind of given up on my education.
Were you interested in girls?
Well, some of them I was. I didn't pay too much attention to them, I guess, in the early years, you know, but I worked some for a friend of Papa's, Zach Mulhall, and he had a big ranch over in the middle of the territory. He also had 3 daughters. Lucy Mulhall was one of the, I think maybe she was the one in the middle. She was about as good a cowgirl as I've ever seen. She could ride and rope with the best of the men. And so I was interested in her. But, well, by the time I was about 20 or so, I had an encounter with a young woman from Arkansas. Her name was Betty Blake. And Betty and I became, well, we became good friends. We did a lot of the things that young people did in those days. We went on a hayride and stood around the piano, sang. She was a piano player, and we had a good time. And I decided pretty soon that my life would be, you know, better if I could convince her to marry me. But Betty always knew a fool when she saw one, and she was hard to convince. And I feel kind of lucky that I finally got her.
Erna Reinhardt.
Welcome to the show, Mr. Rogers.
Thank
It's
you
great
very
to
much.
have you here. One of the things that you are very famous for is your roping ability. So share with our viewers how you learned how to rope, who it was that taught you that, and how you became so good at it.
Well, I don't know that anybody teaches anybody how to rope. You have to practice. But there was a fellow that worked for my papa. His name was Dan Walker. And Dan took me aside when I was just a little fellow, about 4 or 5. He said, we'll get you a rope and take it with you everywhere you go. And you'll always have something to do with your hands and you won't be in trouble. Well, he was right about having something to do with my hands. But my ropes got me in trouble a lot, and mostly in school. But, you know, it was always something that was pleasurable for me, and it always allowed me to use my hands. I have always had a hard time keeping my hands still, and so having a rope in them, you know, helped give them something to do. Now, when I was about 12 or 13 years old, I guess, Papa took me on a trip. We went to Chicago to I think they called it the Columbiad Exposition. And during one of the shows up there, I saw a Mexican roper whose name was Vincent Oropeza. I remember he was dressed in a red velvet suit, and he had ropes that did things that I thought were magic. And I swore to myself that if I had the opportunity, I would teach myself to do some of those tricks. I don't think I've ever become as good as Oropeza, but I don't know, I've spent 6 or 8 hours a day for probably 20 years of my life, you know, with ropes. And they've paid me a pretty good income, better than anybody would expect.
And do you use your ropes for other things other than animals, roping animals?
Well, sometimes I tie the children up, but not often, and they've gotten a little too old for that now. But, you know, a lot of the shows that I did in vaudeville and in the Ziegfeld Follies when I was working with ropes, those were show-off kind of things, you know. But the real work of the cowboy is a lot of times with ropes. You got to rope these 300, 400, 500-pound calves, throw them down on the ground, burn some sort of an insignia on them, you know, which is not too pleasant, I guess, for the calves. But if you treat them kind, they don't mind too much. I keep a number of calves at the ranch out in California now, and on the afternoons after I'm at the movie studio, I go out and get in the saddle. I spend a couple hours before supper roping calves. After 3 or 4 weeks, the calves get so tame they just won't even run, and we have to send them off and bring some others in. You know, but I can't imagine what a person could do in the afternoon that would bring more pleasure than that.
There's a book that's published that's called the Guinness Book of Records, and you're in that book. Do you know what you're in there for?
I have no idea.
For throwing 3 lassos at a time.
Well, I've done that a few times. In fact, I made a film several years ago called Ropin' Fool, which a lot of people think that's probably me. You know, but I'd been in the movies a couple of years. I went out to California with Mr. Goldfish. I mean, I guess he calls himself Goldwyn now. But he had signed me to a contract, and then after a couple of years he said, Will said, our company's not doing very well, and I think you're going to be on your own. And I thought that was fine, so I decided to make movies myself, and one of them I'd made was called The Ropin' Fool. Didn't have much story to it, of course, but that was okay. Most movies don't. But it was an opportunity to show off some of the things I could do with ropes. And one of the tricks we tried to do was one of these 3 rope tricks. A fellow rides a horse down the street, and, well, one of the ropes I did kind of a figure 8. Got the top part of it over the horse's head and the bottom part over his feet. And the second one I threw with my right hand, got the rider. And the third rope I had to use my left hand, and I got it out around the horse and brought it back and caught his back feet. You know, sometimes luck is with you when you do those things.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
That sounds like quite a feat.
A lot of our viewers may not know, Will Rogers, that in the silent cinema in the year 1934, you was voted the most popular male actor in Hollywood.
Well, now, by that time, it wasn't the silent cinema. You know, they were audibles by that time.
But you also had done silent.
Oh, that's right, yes. In fact, most of the films I've done were silent films and pretty short, 2 reelers.
But that was a great compliment that you were the most popular male actor that year. And just tell us about, I know you're modest, but that's you can share with us in the movies and on your tour and in your column. At one point, wasn't it about 7 out of 10 Americans that either read about you each week or saw you or heard you on radio?
That's what I say to my agent, and that's what my agent says to the people that I'm making contracts with. And I hope it's right, you know. But a lot of things that agents say about salaries probably are not always right. But I have had the good fortune, you know, of having a lot of friends. And when I travel all over the country, seems like a lot of people come out and they want to hear some of the foolishness that I've got to say. I can't understand why, but they do.
Well, you just have this incredible, as others have had in different ways, just a natural gift of humor and communication. I wish you'd share with us this question about sometimes you were criticized for your use of the structure that you had of the English language, and the story about a telephone book and a dictionary. It's a wonderful story.
Well, I do most of my column writing on the Western Union blanks on a typewriter, and I just kind of peck, you know. So I don't get to worry very much about capital letters and that sort of thing. And when I send things in, sometimes editors say, well, you should probably look at this again, you know, but it's not exactly correct. And I tell them, you know, I'm not getting paid reading wages. I'm getting paid to write. And a good friend of mine who also writes a column is Odd McIntyre. I don't know if you read his column or not, but it's in the New York papers, you know, about life around New York City. And McIntyre uses a lot of long words. And he said to me once, Will, he says, you need to get a dictionary. And I said, well, Odd, I don't really think so. I said, I might get one, but it's like a telephone book. If you got to look up somebody's number, you probably don't need to call them anyway. And it's the same with words, you know. The Greeks have got a word for it, and the dictionary's got a word for it. But the wonderful thing about the English language is there's always a short word for it, and you ought to just use your own, I think. So that's what I try to do. And simple things are generally better. And it's true with comedy as well, you know, with humor. One of the best comedians that I've ever met is one of our presidents, Calvin Coolidge. And
A man of few words.
A man of very few words, and yet he could make the words work for him as very few men could. I told Calvin once I was up in Massachusetts. I was going to do a show in Boston, and I had gone by. He and his wife, Grace, had just built a place out at Northampton, and I stopped by to visit them. And I said, Calvin, I hope you'll come to the program. He said, well, what's going to happen? I said, well, I'm going to talk, you know, for 2 or 3 hours. And he said, well, what else? I said, well, there's going to be some music. There was a quartet that traveled with me, and I said, they're going to sing some. He thought about it a little bit. He said, well, I might come. He said, I've always liked music.
That took a moment. Yes, that was great. One other story that I want you to tell before I go out the panel, and that is you were, I believe it was Chicago, where you were, and there was the steer that got loose, and
that was New York.
It was New York. You saved the audience, I believe.
Yeah, I had taken a job with a friend of Papa's, Zach Mulhall, the same fellow I talked about before, you know, Lucille's father. He did a Wild West show, and we'd gone to St. Louis and done a show at the World's Exposition, and then we went up to Madison Square Garden, and we're down on the floor of the garden, and cowboys and Indians, some of us dressed different ways, and a lot of cattle and horses, and there was a big longhorn steer, who was a little taller than me, decided he wanted to see a show from up in the second balcony, and he took out for it by way of the audience. Yeah, people were scattering left and right, and I grabbed my rope and I went running up the stairs as fast as I could, got a loop going over my head, threw it out just as far as I could, and was lucky enough to get it over both horns just about the time he got to the seat he was going for, you know. And I pulled it tight. He sat down, he looked back down, and I think he decided it wasn't the seat he wanted after all, because he started back down. And when he got to the bottom, there was a big rail that went around the bottom of the arena, and he went over.
And you're holding.
Well, I'm holding. Yeah, there wasn't anything else I could do, you know, but follow him, and he went over the rail very gracefully, and I decided that that's what I would do too. But just as I got to the rail, the lights went out, and when they came back on, I was in my hotel room. And my good friend was holding a newspaper up in front of my face. He said, "Look here, Will." He says, "You're a hero." And there was a picture there of a fellow with my shirt on, lying face down in the dirt. And the caption underneath says, "Cowboy hero saves audience from wild cow." You know, New Yorkers don't know the difference between a cow and a steer. So my friend said, "Well, if you're going to do that kind of nutty stuff, you really ought to get into vaudeville." And I thought, this is my opportunity. And so I did. And pretty soon I was traveling all over, you know, making as much as $200 a week, which I thought was pretty good. And, you know, when I look back now and I realize that I've had the opportunity even to work for some place like Mr. Ziegfeld's Follies, and the good fortune that I've had in doing stage shows, well, vaudeville seems like a long time ago, but I've been real lucky. I don't know if you've seen Mr. Ziegfeld's show or not. A lot of people, you know, when they go to New York, they go especially to see the Follies, and, well, it's kind of a girly show. You know, Mr. Ziegfeld declared his intention to glorify the American girl, and he glorified a little more of her every year. I once prayed God to just let me live 3 more years to work. But Mr. Ziegfeld and I have always had a wonderful relationship. It was always a handshake relationship. He said, "Will, do you want to sign a contract?" And I said, "No." I said, "You know what I can do. You know what I will do. And I know you'll be fair with me," and he always was. And Mr. Ziegfeld was a fine fellow, and he did a good show, and he was, I tell you, even the girls that worked for him, they were smart. They were smart. A lot of people thought they were just beauties, but they understood income tax better than just about anybody I know, and they knew how to evade it, you know, with marriages and that sort of thing, too. But when Mr. Ziegfeld lost just about everything he had in the stock market crash a few years ago, he and his wife, Billy, came out to California, and we were lucky enough to convince them to come and stay with us for a while. It was, you know, it's always nice to be able to give back to somebody when they've been so generous to you, and he's been a fine friend. And when he became ill and passed on, Eddie Cantor, you know, a friend of mine and a fellow who I had worked with in the Follies, we were pleased to be in a position to help take care of the expenses for that, and that you know, that's just a hard thing for a family to lose somebody like that, and it was very hard for his wife. So,
thank you.
Well, I didn't mean to get us
That's
into
fine.
something so sad.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Janelle.
Well, Mr. Rogers, you've been known to spin a rope, but you also spin a tale, and that's part of the reason that so many Americans love you. Can you do one of those tales for us today? Can you tell us a story? You're a storyteller.
Well, most of the stories I tell, you know, about other people, and I pick on people. I mean, that depends. Some people ask me about the gags I tell and the stories I tell in the papers, and they ask me if I write my own stuff. I tell them I don't have to write it, you know. I'd go to Washington every once in a while, drop in and see what the boys is doing, and I just report the facts. So a lot of my stories, you know, are stories about politicians, which a lot of people think they're just as soon not here. But I know some of these guys, you know, pretty well, and I've had an opportunity to be with them. I think most of our congressmen, well, they're better than we think, you know, and I hesitate to tell stories about them exactly, you know, but most of them are good guys, and you get to know them one at a time. Of course, we used to say that about the Dalton boys and the James gang back when I was growing up. You know, you get to know them one at a time, they're fine. It's when they get together that they get to be a menace. And Congress is a little like that too. So, you know, when they're home and they're befriending you, you want to hold on to them. Well, a story. I guess one story that I might tell. Well, it's really about a visit that I had with Mr. Ford, Henry Ford, a couple of years ago. I was flying up to Dearborn. That's kind of a story in itself. I got on an airplane that almost had to crash land in Chicago, but. Anyway, we did land safe, and I was happy to do that. Well, we got there for the birthday party for Mr. Edison. He was celebrating his birthday. You know, he invented the light bulb the same year that I was born. I feel kind of honored.
You were two
But,
things, one on election day and then the light
That's
bulb.
right, the same year as the light bulb.
That was a good omen.
But yeah, anyway, I was visiting with Mr. Ford, and I said, Henry, you know, he had just dropped the price of the Model T. You know, everybody in the country seems like can afford a Model T. Well, he had just dropped the price to $400, and I said, Henry, how cheap do you think you can sell these cars? And he looked at me for a minute, and he said, very seriously, he said, Will, if I can control the sale of the parts, I can give the cars away. He said, every one of them will shake off enough bolts in the first year to pay for itself, and after that, everything is just pure profit. You see, that's the kind of person we need in the White House, somebody that thinks like that. So I'm for Mr. Ford for president. If anybody wants to know.
Erna Reinhardt.
You were born in Oklahoma.
Well, it was Indian Territory when I started. It's become Oklahoma since then.
Right.
And it's a state that I'm very proud of. We're catching up, you know, with the rest of the country. We're only about 25 years old, and we've already impeached 2 governors. In fact, the situation is such that the governor often doesn't, well, when he sends his laundry out, he says, I'll just pick it up. You know, because he can't leave an address. He doesn't know where he's going to be in a week or 2.
Exactly. But you did vaudeville, and then you ended up in New York, I think. Share with us how you ended up being in Hollywood and how you survived doing more than 70 movies.
Well, I was working for Mr. Ziegfeld, as I said before, and a good friend of mine, Rex Beach, had written a book called Laughing Bill Hyde, and he decided he wanted to make a film of it. And his wife said, well, his wife was a friend of mine, Ms. Fred Stone, and Mr. Beach's wife says, I think the person to play that part in the movie is Will Rogers. And so I was asked if I would do it, and I'd never thought about being in the movies before, but because they were friends, I said, well, I'll give it a try. And so we did. We made the movie down in New Jersey. And when we finished, it wasn't much of a success, really, but I guess it got in front of a few other people. And this fellow, Mr. Goldfish, said, well, if you are interested in movies, I'll offer you a contract for 2 years, he said. But he said, you got to move to California because everything in the movies is in California. So I did. I talked to the family, and we agreed that this might be a good opportunity to go. The children were still quite young, and we thought, well, I mean, we were living out on Long Island, and that was a nice place. But, you know, children growing up close to New York City is not something that we really had thought we wanted to do. And so we get a chance to grow up out in the sunshine in California. So anyway, we went out there. And after we got settled in, as I mentioned before, after a couple of years, Mr. Goldfish, or Golden, whatever he was calling himself then, says, Will, I'm sorry, but I can't renew the contract. And I thought that was good news, actually, because not because I wanted out of films, because I was having a pretty good time. It was easy work. But I thought I can do these myself and make a lot more money. And I did. I made 3 or 4, but by that time I realized that the hard part of making movies was in the distribution, you see. And I didn't know how to do that, and I got myself in a little bit of financial trouble. And that's why I prized the friendship with Mr. Ziegfeld, because when I wrote him, he said, well, Will, you know, we'd be glad to have you come back and be in the Follies. And so I did. I would go back there for part of the year, and I would do my little rope spinning part of the Follies, and he paid me well for that. And along the way, while I was back in New York, I was invited to write for the papers. Mr. Oakes at the Times came over and said, Will, if you'd like to write a piece for Sunday, we might use it. And so I said, well, I don't know that I could write anything, but I'll try. And I gave it to him. He said, well, we'll do this again if you want. And after 2 or 3 weeks, I found out that he was selling my stuff, to somebody else. And it was, they've got these syndicates now that send stories out to all the different papers. And this was the McNaught Syndicate, and they said, well, Will, if you can keep this up, we believe we can sell it. And so that was a good deal, and that helped pay some of my debts. And I've been very fortunate, to sort of fall into things like that. So I was making movies, and I was writing for the papers, and I was back doing the Follies, during part of the year. And then I met this fellow, Taylor, who said, Will, if you'd like to put together a tour, a lecture tour of some sort, he thought there was probably some money in that. And by that time, I figured, well, Betty'd always said, he said, Will, you're the wooliest talker I've ever known. You just talk all the time until you get home, and then you just disappear behind a newspaper and you're gone. And she's right about that.
On that note, I have to end this wonderful interview with Will Rogers and go out of character for our wonderful guest. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest is Dr. Doug Watson. He holds a degree in English, from, including a bachelor's degree from Baylor University and a master's from West Texas State, and his doctorate is from Texas Tech University, and he's been in the field of education and of course, doing this wonderful role. Dr. Watson, this is the major character you do, and how many times have you done this now?
Oh, I lost count a long time ago, Tony.
But
400 or 500 times.
Yeah. All over the United States, and I believe it's a Centennial in Oklahoma, and you're doing a lot of schools there now.
It's really sort of become my life project. Yeah. As I said in the auditorium, the show this morning, I think there are certain characters who are very important for us to keep alive in our culture. And for a while, keeping someone alive is not so hard as long as there's a generation who remembers him or her. That generation is about gone with Will Rogers. To have seen him alive on stage, a person today would probably need to have been 85 years old. Yes. And there are a few of those people.
But through this format, you can do that, and a lot of the characters. We're running out of time, but thank you so much for doing that, and because he was a fascinating person in our history. Thank you again, Dr. Doug Watson. It's a pleasure having you here. The good news is you'll be back in a couple of weeks, and you're going to be with Mark Twain, and you'll do a dialogue together.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be with us again next week at the same time. We'll continue our Celebrating Humor and Music. Until then, I would like to wish all of you a very good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.